All right, class, gather around, gather around. We are really gonna learn today. Hey, everyone, welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. I'm your host, Francie, and we have one that I'm so excited to bring you today. A lot of questions that we get here as the Out of Spec team, as anyone really working with or around or interested in EVs, is questions about utilities and the electrical grid. And today I have an interview with Kevin Hernandez from ScottMadden. It's a consultancy company in an energy practice area, working heavily with EVs, with grid modernization and grid edge technology. And he has so much to share today. I truly felt like I was getting to talk to a professor who was answering all the questions that I had. And I've been gathering these for a while with the help of conversations with y'all, the audience, and also from stuff that I've just been curious myself. So if you're wondering about rates for DC fast charging versus level 2 and level 1. We break that down. We talk about how really modernization of the grid is going. Does it differ across the country? What is the best technology, hardware, software that utilities are implementing? What is the utilities' goals when it comes to the future of the grid and modernization? How would you describe the state of EV infrastructure? All of this is stuff that we go into in today's episode. And like I said, it was really, really interesting. We even talk about the I'll ever ask question of what is taking transformers so long to get to the site. So let's plug in for another episode of the Out of Spec podcast and talk about all of that right now. This episode is made possible by the support we get from Fort Collins Kia. If you are in the market for any electric Kia, not only do they never add market adjustments, they will deliver your car to you anywhere in the 48 contiguous states for out-of-spec viewers. More information in the link in the show notes. Okay, everyone, I am now joined by Kevin Hernandez, who is a partner with ScottMadden, where you specialize in grid edge and energy storage, and you've consulted on a variety of transmission and distribution utility clients for a wide range of problems, issues, concerns, projects that I think outfit you with a great background to come onto the Out of Spec podcast and talk all things EV and utilities and the grid. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Well, thank you, Francie. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk about the subject. I think this is something that I get very excited about, and so I hope your listeners do as well.
Yes, I think that they will. I also personally share that excitement to talk about this, which is kind of funny, but I think it's because I looking and seeing about how all these moving parts come together to create like the electric vehicle ecosystem. There's a lot of questions that come up and even more layers where I'm like curious about, okay, how does that project actually get done? Or how are these decisions gone about? Or what is making this picture of an EV ecosystem? So really excited to have you on. And I might start off with this question, which is, you work with ScottMadden, so maybe you can explain a little bit more about what it means to be a partner with the company and what kind of projects you take on that you've been able to also gain this experience and background with.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so ScottMadden's, we're a management consulting firm, and we got our start in power and utilities, and we still do a lot of our work in that area, the majority of our work in that area. And I would say that in the beginning, it was really just around helping utilities and power companies operate in more efficient ways. But maybe over the last few years, the last 10 years or so, as the clean energy transition has really taken off, a lot of our work has transitioned to becoming more focused on helping those clients integrate distributed energy resources like energy storage and solar, EVs, all kinds of these new technologies, grid modernization, how do they upgrade the grid, digitalization, et cetera. And what's been really exciting the last few years is that it's gone beyond just working with those companies and working with a lot of other kind of newer non-energy companies, or what used to be non-energy companies that are now kind of interacting with the electric system in a lot of different ways. So it's given us a front row seat in really both sides of the equation, helping utilities understand these kind of new customers in a way, and helping those new customers or new those businesses kind of interact and understand how utilities work.
That sounds pretty fun. Get to interact with all the moving parts. And I do think it's interesting that you mentioned how there are different entities, organizations moving into the energy space, because I was just talking with someone yesterday about how, Yeah, I mean, even automakers are creating like battery solar energy systems to have at home now that they're making EVs. So stepping into this new realm and taking on that new project. But of course, when you start thinking about utilities, it gets bigger and bigger. So thanks for that overview. I think that really sets the stage here with the work that you do and yeah, how you're helping to I don't know, modernize the grid, help figure out how
Mhm.
to improve the state of EV infrastructure. And I was curious, what, if you could describe it, like what is the state of EV infrastructure right now? Because it changes rapidly, and it's changed rapidly in the past year. So, how would you describe it right now? Where do we stand?
Yeah, it really is changing quickly. And, when I think of EV charging infrastructure and the grid infrastructure, there's really kind of two sides of the same coin, right? You've got the charging infrastructure, and we're all familiar, those of us who drive EVs, with the EV chargers and that kind of infrastructure that has to be out there to allow us to charge. But then there's that whole grid side of it, right? The whole other part of this, which is they call it one of the world's largest, machines, right? They're complex machines. And it's interesting because, the grid has been around for a really long time, right? And it was, in some cases, 100 years or so. And so it was built in a time and place, that has really changed, right? So, the industry went through very little change, at least from a technical standpoint, for many, many years. And then all of a sudden we have a tremendous amount of change. And so one of the most exciting things about what we do is just managing through that, right? This whole transition process. But the grid as a system, was built for one-way power flows, or we generate power at a big power station and we send it through transmission lines and distribution lines to homes and businesses, and we sent it to places that were stationary, right? And now with EVs, we have those things are moving around, and so where is that load gonna? When I say load, I mean the end use for electricity, and where is that going to be, and how much capacity needs to be there to serve it. At the same time, the system's getting older, right? And so utilities are investing a lot of money just to upgrade the system, make it more modern. So there's really kind of some competing demands there. And then probably the last piece would just be that the way that we used to use the system has changed. It used to be that everybody woke up in the morning and you turn on your lights, and so there's a bit of a bump in the morning, and then when you go to work, the demand for electricity rises throughout the day, and then kind of peaks in the late evening and afternoon when air conditionings come on and lights come on and things like that. And then overnight goes back down again. But that's starting to shift a little bit. And particularly with EVs and EV charging, when we have the ability to change or decide when we want to use the energy, right? If you have to turn on lights because it's dark, you got to turn it on then, right? But we can decide when we charge our vehicles. And so there's some new dynamics there. For utilities, this is causing a lot of change. And so it's putting a lot of demands on them to both change the grid and upgrade the grid, and then also change how they used to operate and how they kind of manage these customers. It's pretty fascinating.
It is fascinating because that is multifaceted. How are we managing what we're doing internally and then also the grid, the physicality of the grid and the new technology. Can you tell me a little bit more about these changes that you've seen in the energy sector regarding EVs, EV adoption, and grid modernization for someone who's not really familiar about how that happens?
Yeah, sure. So, the traditional process is that, a utility every year or so will look at their system and say, well, maybe there's a new subdivision going in here, or a new, box store going in here, or some new development. And they'll build the system and they'll make the investments in the system to meet that new demand for electricity. And that happens just kind of on an ongoing basis. At the same time, they maintain the system for storms. If a storm knocks out some power, if trees fall in lines, obviously they're going back and replacing those, and then they're just maintaining the system overall. And historically, that's been driven by two things: keeping the lights on, so just a reliability component of the electric system, and then keeping rates affordable. And so that's kind of been the mandate for utilities for many, many years. Really, the last 20 or 25 years has been affordability and reliability, both of which continue to be important, right? All of us are focused on electric bills and are aware of bills going up, but also very focused on, when the lights go out. Now they're also starting to build the system out to handle some of these new capabilities. And so when we talk about grid modernization, we're talking about taking something that was very much a wires and machines kind of system, digitalizing it, so giving utilities more visibility into the system from a digital standpoint, more remote control types of things, and more capabilities. One of the other shifts we're seeing is a lot more resources like solar, energy storage, wind, other kinds of resources are coming out of the system now and feeding back into the system instead of it being that one-way power flow. Now we've got this two-way power flow. In fact, when we talk about vehicle to grid, maybe something that happens down the road a bit, that's another one of those things that starts injecting power back into the energy system. And the legacy grid really wasn't built for that. So grid modernization is kind of making these upgrades, both in terms of the age of the infrastructure, but when you're replacing something, you're not going to replace it with an old, out-of-date component. You want to make sure that it's modern and can do some of the newer kinds of things that we needed to do. So a lot of that, it's upgrading it and making it better, and at the same time, hopefully a little bit more resilient.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big undertaking because, like you're saying, like this is the infrastructure that has been there. These are the systems that have been there, and the technology is kind of quickly changed, and so it's quickly retrofitting or upgrading these whole systems to fit the needs for now, which seems like a pretty big undertaking for utilities.
It is, and the challenge for utilities, one of the biggest challenges is probably cost, right? How do you do that in a way that doesn't just make bills go up really quickly, right? As soon as bills go up, people's appetite for those kinds of investments really goes down. And particularly because you and I, we don't really see that, right? The lights don't look different when they come on for us, right? So we don't really see these kinds of investments and until a storm comes through or something else. And so it's hard for us to say, oh, well, my bill keeps on going up and I don't really see anything different about it. So, I think the challenge is really for them is really about, how do you provide this additional service and build out this system in a way that needs to be done without doing it, too quickly or too expensively.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you say, it's hard for us to see. And I'm thinking, yeah, it is. The one thing that I have noticed is that my city has started, our streetlights used to be hanging, it's all wired. And then, they would sway on the wire. And now they're the fixed big metal structures. And I was like, then I started looking up, I'm like, oh my God, there's wires all over this old city. Yeah. And how slowly having to build in the new systems. I mean, that's just like that's kind of transportation, but they're powered by energy. So I think it does link in there.
Yeah, and most of those streetlights now they're LEDs, right? And so that they're more efficient, and there's a lot of improvements on the margins.
Yeah, a lot of improvements that are still, like you're saying, coming because these are big projects to undertake it all at once. I think, it would drive up costs. And we were speaking about affordability, costs in general. And I think that's a good transition into really taking it to the basics of EV charging. And when I think about it, what I know about it, obviously with DC fast charging, you are pulling a lot more energy at one time. So that makes sense that it would cost more per kilowatt hour, usually is how we're seeing it charged now. Sometimes it's per minute, and versus level 2, level 1 charging, that's asking for that energy at a slower pace. But can you explain to me the cost differences that are between DC fast charging and then the other charging levels from a basic point of view?
I will do my best, Francie. So tell me if this gets into the weeds a little bit or gets a little wonky, but there are really two components that we think of when we think about energy delivery or power delivery and bills. And I actually think EV drivers know this better than most electric customers. All of us, true. I think all of us or those of us who drive EVs are used to kind of going up to a station. And we've become, over the years, right, we've become familiar with, okay, this is a 50 kilowatt charger. This is maybe a 150 or 350 kilowatt charger. We all prefer the faster one, right? Because we know that it gets us the energy we need more quickly. So that's one component. And that's kind of the size of, the way I think about it is the size of the pipe. Is it a big pipe or is it a small pipe? A 150 kilowatt charger is going to be bigger than a 50 kW charger. What that means is it can deliver more energy to you at any given point in time, right? The other side of that is what actually goes into the batteries of the vehicles, or into the light bulbs, or into the appliances in our homes, which is what we call kilowatt hours, right? And the difference is there, we have the pipe for is kW, or kilowatts, and the energy flowing through, or the water flowing through that pipe, if you want to use that analogy, is to kilowatt hours. And that's what's actually going into your battery when you're charging an EV. For utility, the kilowatt hours is really not much of a concern, or not as much of a concern. They still have to make sure they can serve that when it's needed, so that when you turn on the light switch, the lights come on. But when they're charging, or when they're building out the infrastructure, the bigger that pipe has to be, right, to deliver that energy in a quicker way or a faster way, the more it costs. And it costs a lot. It scales pretty quickly. And the reason for that is because the wires have to be able to handle that extra capacity, the extra energy flowing, physically, the energy flowing through the cables. The components have to be rated to handle that amount of electricity. That's why DCFC chargers themselves cost so much more than a level 2 charger. They just have to be able to handle that raw power. Same thing for utility. When utility is going to hook up a large DCFC station somewhere, maybe with a couple different plugs, a couple different chargers, they're going to have to make sure they can serve all of that load, or all of that demand for electricity at that rated level. So if you have, a couple 150 kW chargers, they're going to add that up and say, okay, we need to make sure we can serve this. And they have to build out the grid in a way to deliver it. Now, for the most part, we're seeing DCFC chargers. A lot of those are being put in. Obviously, we've seen EA chargers in Walmarts and parking lots, and Target. There's a supercharger down the road here at a Target. But in a lot of the NEVI stations are going in along the interstates. That's not necessarily where the grid was built out to serve customers, because the customers weren't always there before. Now, in the cases of the big box stores, maybe they were, but certainly not the highway EV chargers. And so the infrastructure simply just costs a lot, and then they have to build it and construct it. And what we've seen a lot is that they put in a DCFC station, and because they need to upgrade the system that's there. The system that's there is not big enough or not strong enough to deliver that quantity of power, so it requires upgrades, and that drives the cost. Now, the cost of energy is somewhat detached from that, but primarily it's really an infrastructure thing, I think, at this point.
I love that. I think you painted that picture so well, and I truly learned something new, because that obviously that makes sense. You have to build out the infrastructure to get that power there. So it's not necessarily, oh, you're pulling more power, we're going to charge you more for it. But think about all the steps that it took to get it to you and what did not exist before. Thank you. That was really great. I don't think you got too into the weeds. I think also our listeners will enjoy that as well.
Well, and you mentioned on the level 2 side, for if anyone's connected a level 2 charger at their home, they realize that sometimes you have to do some upgrades there, but for the most part, it's running off of a voltage you've already got in your house, and that's why those don't cost as much.
Yeah, and like curbside charging that can take advantage. I know spots in Canada, they found that if they put in LED lights in the street lights, that they could then take the leftover and do some slow curbside charging. So at some points you can find the energy, but when you're thinking about exactly how much is being pulled with DC fast charging, it likely wasn't there, like you're saying. But level 2 and level 1 didn't require that infrastructure to be built to allow it to happen. It's kind of just there.
Yep.
Amazing. And so I do know, so that makes sense there. And then there are things like demand charges. And I, having worked in the public infrastructure side of things, oh my gosh, they can vary state to state. They can really make a site totally unfeasible to put in, because it's just going to cost you at the wazoo. But can you explain to me what demand charges are?
Yeah. So it goes along with this is the financial side of what we just discussed, right? So most residential electricity customers, all of us in our homes or apartments, are billed really just on the energy we use, that kilowatt hours or the kWh. So there are other components to the bill, but primarily it's we are billed about according to how much we use. If you are a large consumer, if you're a commercial customer or a charging station, a larger charging station, you also frequently have what is called a demand charge. And the demand charge is related to the size of that pipe. And so if you are a customer that in a given period of time, usually a month or some period of weeks, a billing period, you're charged at different tiers of rates depending on that kilowatt number. So not how much energy you're using, but at any given time, how much you're using at that one moment. So for instance, and this is really interesting for charging station developers, I think, because if you're operating a DCSC station, let's say, and you've got two 150 kilowatt chargers with maybe 2 plugs each, so you've got 4 plugs there. One vehicle goes in there and can plug in, and you're already charging it, and assuming the vehicle can take it, you're already charging at that 150 kilowatt. And so the charging station owner then is billed a demand charge for 150 kilowatt, right? Now, if you have 4 vehicles go in there, maybe you're using all those plugs simultaneously, you're still only maxing out at that, whatever that maximum threshold of kilowatts is going to be. And so, if you've got them all charging at the same time, likely they're splitting the rate between those 4 plugs. And so you're likely charging below that 150 kilowatts per charger, perhaps. And so the demand charge charged to the station owner would be spread out across, it would be the same, wouldn't go up, and would be spread out across 4 different customers. And so demand charges are there as a function so that the costs of the system are borne by the customers or by the end users who use that high power, right? At most people's homes, we don't use that high power, so they just don't even put that component on the bill. Now, so it serves a function, it serves a purpose, right? So that you and I don't end up paying these very high costs, maybe for an aluminum smelter or for the Walmart down the street or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So it serves a purpose, but for charging it has been an issue, right? Because then it makes it very hard to economically deploy public fast charging without making it very, very expensive. And so, we've worked with some of our clients. I know many utilities and regulators in different states within the U.S. are working on different tariffs and different rates so that they can modify that in some way so that it's not such a burden. The trick is doing that in a way that the utility can capture or not have to socialize all those costs across all the other customers.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine. Yeah. So it's kind of taking something that was in place and having to shape it now to a different pull from the grid, to the different need for energy with EV charging and reshaping that. So that's part of your role, is to kind of find something that still serves both purposes that a demand charge would.
Yeah. And so, you can think of it, that's right. Yeah. And so we'll help, some of our clients come up with some of those ideas and help understand what's happening in different states. And that's another interesting part of the utility industry, is that it's really within the U.S. divided up into 50 different jurisdictions, really kind of 51 if you include DC, and each one has its own regulator. And so we see EV development and EV regulation and rates regulation develop at different paces around the country, depending on customer demands and political climates and other things. So it's always interesting for our clients to say, okay, well, what are other utilities doing? What are other states doing? And let's, what are the good ideas and what can we take from here or there? And so we do a lot of that as well.
I guess that is a benefit of having a lot of different things going on, is like someone can learn the lesson over there and then take it and employ it over here. I see that just in general. California tries like everything with EV infrastructure and EVs and all sorts of things. And it's kind of like, okay, there's a little petri dish of experimentation over there. We can learn from them and then take what works for us.
That's right.
I think it's a cool approach. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you, California.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, California, for doing it all first. And we can see what works and what doesn't, because it is difficult. And there's so much variation as well in how utilities function and charging costs. And I know that there was a difference between, there was even legislation about charging per minute or per kilowatt hour, and that has changed over time with the changing climate as well. But generally, is it true that there are pretty dramatically varying costs when it comes to EV charging and EV infrastructure across like this nation with our utility system?
Yeah, sure. And and part of that is just because electricity costs different amounts in different parts of the country, and there are a lot of different factors for that. We tend to think of the grid as one thing, but really we have lots and lots of very small grids, and those are interconnected together. And then we have, in the U.S., is really divided into three major grids that are largely independent, although there are some interconnections in between them. But the amount of power and how it's generated and by what fuel it's generated from differs from place to place. And as a result, the cost of power changes quite a bit. And so in areas that are very gas dependent, natural gas dependent for their generation, those are really driven by the price of natural gas. When you see gas prices very high, you see power costs a lot. When gas prices go back down like they are right now, power tends to be a little bit cheaper. And then, the converse can be true for areas with a lot of hydropower generation, for instance, or that, and those resources can tend to keep power prices a little bit lower, depending. And so there are different factors like that. Weather has become one of the, real key factors, at least from a short-term perspective. When you have large weather events, it tends to drive prices higher. We've seen this in Texas many times over the last couple of years. We've seen it with the heat waves this year and last. So power prices themselves fluctuate quite a bit. In terms of infrastructure costs, that really becomes very localized. It really depends on, is it an urban or a rural environment? Is there already capacity on the grid there to serve additional customers or additional needs? Or does that capacity has to be built out? And so it can really be, and even within one utility's service territory or their footprint, you can have two sides of it that are two different prices because one has excess capacity and one has a deficit of capacity.
It seems like this variation is a little bit unavoidable, but also exists for specific reasons that you just mentioned. So is there an approach to try to become more uniform, or it's this is how there does have to be variation because this is the way that it is?
Yeah, we have some regional wholesale markets which attempt to drive down prices through increased competition and things like that. But that's not the case in all parts of the country. I don't think, one of the things you'll hear said in the energy industry or the power industry is that, we haven't maybe ever had a national energy policy. And you can make arguments whether that's true or not. And certainly we've seen over the last, handful of years, a real concerted effort at the federal level to fund a lot of the clean energy transition, new technologies and things. And so, there's that, but is that really truly an energy policy? I don't think there's a lot of momentum to try to get to a national energy price or to levelize those costs. There's just too many regional variations. And certainly if you're in a region that has lower power costs, you're not going to want those to change. And so I don't think that'll happen anytime soon. Now, one thing that's interesting, though, once we get all the EV infrastructure built out that we think we need, that's a big amount of spending that'll be done, right? And then we'll just be maintaining it and improving it on the margin. So maybe that'll help. Although the view in the industry is we have a lot of capacity to build. AI and data centers is really going to be soaking up a lot in addition to EV charging. So we may see bills go up. I hate to tell you.
Don't tell me that. No, but I'm not surprised at all. But I just realized that usually I'm thinking about what's going on right now with the EV infrastructure, but there will be a day where technically probably we have the infrastructure built out, and what will that look like? I guess I don't really know, but you can try. No, not really. I would be awesome though. I feel like we are moving in the right direction though, but you mentioned something that I do want to touch on because demand rates, I think, have also been, there's also time of use, that can change pricing. So time of use rates, encouraging or incentivizing or disincentivizing folks to use energy at certain times. Like in Colorado, we would have higher rates later in the day where it would be try not to use your air conditioning or we're going to charge you a little bit of a higher rate. So do we also see that as well when it comes to EV charging? Yeah, certainly.
So time of use rates it's interesting. For the utility and managing that, I talked earlier about, how the demand kind of changes throughout the day, right? And in the afternoon, late afternoon and evening is when the demand is greatest on the system. The utilities build the system, build the grid in order to handle that very highest peak of energy, that very highest point in time when we're going to use the energy system. And that usually is sometime over the summer. And what I find is really fascinating about this is they may build that system, they may build out the grid to handle that peak energy demand for just a couple days of the year, right? And it's those couple days of the year where air conditioning, it's the hottest, usually the hottest, and this is changing a little bit with more electric heating, but typically it's been those hottest days of the year where everyone's got their ACs going and, they're cranking and everyone's at home running the dishwashers and all that stuff. And that energy demand just really, really spikes up. And when that's, at that moment in time is what the utility is going to build out the grid to handle. The rest of the year, that's not the case. And so we have this excess, we have the capacity in the system that may not be being used all the time. On a daily basis, the utilities are trying to manage that demand also. And so time of use rates are a way to encourage people to use energy when it's cheapest. And it's cheapest also for the grid, right? Cheapest in terms of not having to expand the system or not have to build it out to handle more demand, because we can change that demand to go at different times when it can be handled easier. And so the TOU rates are one way that utilities have approached this. And they work to some effect, but I think, for many of us, we're fortunate enough that power prices are not crazy. At least in some parts of the country, I know they're higher than others, but most of us are, want to get home and we want to get our cars charged and we want to run the dishwasher and do our laundry, when we're awake and not overnight and things like that. But TOU rates help to change that. One interesting thing is that there was a study that came out maybe a year ago, maybe a little longer, that said instead of getting EV drivers to charge overnight, we should be getting them to charge during the day. And when you look at the details of it, they were only talking about the west part of the U.S., not the rest of the country. And the reason is, particularly in California, but in a lot of places in the West, we have an excess supply of generation during the day. We have more electricity than we can use. And so, and that's because we have a lot of solar development during the day there. And so we want to use as much of that solar energy to charge EVs during the day and not have them go back home at night and charge when that solar goes away and there's a lot less capacity. And the rest of the country is the opposite, right? We have, the peak goes down at night, and so we want to charge at night. But there's an interesting flip-flop depending on the resource mix.
Yeah, that is a flip-flop. And technically, is it true to think that solar energy is technically cheaper because we're not generating it ourselves, but also it took putting in the solar panels and that infrastructure behind it as well?
Yeah, depending on where it looks different depending on where you sit. I think some would say it's more costly. Certainly the marginal cost is lower, right? Because there's no fuel cost, right? There's no input cost. The sun's free. We did have to build out the infrastructure for it and everything else. And some would say that it's caused some issues and those costs of resolving those issues from kind of an engineering perspective don't get factored back into energy prices. And then others, as I'm sure you're aware, people will say, well, wait a minute, subsidies. And so there's that whole discussion. I don't know that we get into here, but there's a lot of debate about whether it's cheaper or not, but it's certainly cleaner. And it's certainly, there's lower marginal costs.
And you were saying, it might be the better idea in some places to charge EVs during the day, but, we don't always have like at work charging amenities, which is, we should. That would be great, especially in California, if you have to park your car while you're working at the office, to have that there and be able to take advantage of it. So it does point to, I've seen the research. I think typically we think, okay, we need the fast charging infrastructure, but we also need the level 1, level 2 curbside at work charging, at home charging, wherever cars are parked, garage charging.
That is totally right. And it's interesting because you're right. I think that most of us, when we want to go to the DCSE charger and we want to charge quickly and we want those to be available, and we certainly don't want to have to wait, in a queue for, to get to a charger. But, where the cars sit, 92% of the day, there's a lack of charging maybe. And I read a study recently, the ICCT put this out last year that said, in their view, we already have almost double the amount of DCFC that we need, right? And I think most people would say, no way, there's no way that's true, right? Because, when I go to find a public charger, I can't find one. But their argument is we have a shortage, a real shortfall in level 2 charging at long dwell time locations. So, and work is the best example, right? The cars sit there for, guaranteed 8 hours or so. And, workplace charging would be such a huge advantage. And so they think that we need to really push the level 2 public charging in a way that we've pushed DCFC so far.
That's interesting. Yeah, like maybe we don't have double if there's no level 2 or level 1 charging, but there is the need for that. And I feel like it's just open for opportunity. In other regions, like Europe has done a lot of curbside charging that you can just take advantage of. And there's more companies coming along where it's electric. They're doing some pilots where they have these curbside chargers. And then I, as a customer, have my cable. So it's not there all the time, but I have it in my car. If I pull up next to a curbside charger, I can plug in. But yeah, it's kind of like, okay, if we have to shift the mindset a little bit too, where DC fast charging is not the only one that we need. We need it in multi-unit housing as well. And any condos that are being built and parking garages. Yeah, I feel like it's almost like when I'm in a plane and I look at all the tops of warehouses that are just blank, I'm like, that could be filled with solar. Like, look at all these parking lots that could have, and take advantage of also, like we were talking about earlier, the energy that's already there.
I think so. Every time I look at a parking lot, I think solar canopies, right? And how much would I like to park under shade anyway? So yeah, I know exactly where you're coming from.
Yeah, totally. And if I'm charging, I want to be under a solar canopy. Like in this heat wave, I've done some road trips. I've been like, I would just love to be in the shade, but I'm in a Walmart parking lot. But at least it's there for my road trips. And we talked a bit about incentivizing and disincentivizing and utilities. And then also I've seen some instances of utilities actually derating some infrastructure in order to manage peak demand periods or whatever they're doing. But maybe could you explain to me the concept of derating and how it would help utilities and why they would enact this kind of action? I think they've had like warnings on some EV chargers that during this time it might be derated, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just, it all gets back to managing the grid. And when the grid becomes overloaded, in other words, so there's too much demand for electricity that can be supplied, it causes a lot of just technical kind of engineering related issues, power quality issues, and so on. And in the public, we call these like brownouts or blackouts or other types of things. And so the folks who operate the grid, there are people in control rooms 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, holidays, 365 days a year, whose core function is to manage the flow of electricity through all of these different grids. And one of their, when they see that those imbalances in the system, they take different actions to manage those. And that's just so that the whole system as a whole stays up and stays functioning. That's in my mind, that's kind of a way of managing, it's a managing demand, right? But it's kind of a forceful way, right? It's the stick, not the carrot way of doing it. And, we talk a lot about managed charging, and this kind of goes back to that TOU rates concept, but it's, are there incentives to charging at times when it's least impactful on the grid? And so derating a charger, would be viewed as an emergency measure. It would be something that, when it's a really extreme situation, we would rather keep the hospital running than, and charge slower or derate this charging station or something else. Those are the kinds of decisions they're making there. There's no, there's no other reasons for them to, they don't make more money if they derate it, or they don't, there's nothing like that. It's purely about balancing the system and keeping the flow of energy balanced. But it also goes back to, in the long term, do they have enough capacity and do they have the infrastructure there to deliver it quickly enough? And I suspect in those places where they make those kinds of calls, it's because they don't have one or both of those things there, and they're kind of really on the margins of what the system can handle.
Interesting. And would you put that underneath the term of grid modernization, which is like building out that infrastructure that's needed to meet the needs, or is that a bit different? Is that more about managing versus building
Yeah,
out?
a little bit more about managing, but we have to think of those in concert, right? Because I think we don't want to put in we don't want to go back to the dumb grid, right? With the kind of the dumb system. We want to make sure that if we're going to make those investments, we can make them in ways, and we can. And another interesting thing is that there are new technologies now that didn't exist before that allow the grid to be more dynamic, right? So that maybe you can have a system in place and get more out of that, more capacity out of the system that's there, rather than having to replace it or upgrade it. And so that's pretty exciting. There's a lot, and that's kind of the grid modernization angle of that infrastructure piece.
Can you maybe provide for me a successful example of grid modernization or a project that ScottMadden has been involved in, so I can get a picture of what that would look like?
Sure. So we've done a number of these projects for different clients around the country that have had either requirements from their regulators to develop a grid modernization program, or other kinds of requirements to create investment plans or distribution system plans and demonstrate how they're modernizing the grid. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be to support electrification. It can be to support distributed energy resource like solar and battery integration. There's a number of different reasons they may be exploring this. And what we would typically help them do is say, okay, well, what are those drivers? What are the things you need to be able to do? There are things called distributed energy resource management systems, which a lot of companies are putting together or buying. Their software systems that allow them to monitor and then control these different resources that are out there on the grid. It's only been a few years since intelligent meters were put on the system. We call those advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI. Before that, the meters were really just one way, and all it told them was how much energy was being used, not why or when or how. And so there's a lot of investments and developments like that. And so having that visibility into the system, and then they develop plans around, okay, well, we're going to make an investment in this kind of technology first, and then this one will be foundational to this next generation of technologies. Or they may say, well, we want to make investments that allow us to integrate more EV charging in the system. So we're going to put in place these kind of bedrock or foundational investments. And so it's really about developing this kind of investment plan. Again, back to what we started with, over a period of time that the costs are manageable, reasonable, and can be integrated in the right way. The individual technologies, really get into the minutia in terms of dynamic line ratings and different grid devices they can go on and allow the grid to operate in different ways. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening there to try to get more efficiencies and more juice from the squeeze, if you will.
That's so cool. Yeah, I love thinking about like the anatomy of it and kind of improving it along the way. Do you feel like especially from like the studies that you've read, the research you've done, the projects you've done, do you feel like the grid is modernizing at a rate that matches what we need with the new technology, from EVs to just electrifying homes more and all that stuff?
It really depends, and it's happening at an uneven pace around the country, and it's uneven for different reasons. In some cases, there may be areas that don't need to modernize as quickly because maybe it's a system in a rural area and there's not a lot of customers, and maybe there's excess capacity on the system, and so there may be less need to immediately put those things in place. In other areas, maybe areas that are affected more often by severe weather, where there's more electrification happening or other types of change, you may be really behind the curve, right? And so it's been interesting to see how this has changed or how this has happened at different paces and at different rates, depending on what part of the country you're looking at. Some utilities are very ambitious about, making these grid modernization investments and other kinds of investments in the system. Others want to, but maybe are hamstrung for cost reasons or other kind of financial reasons. And then there are others that would say, is it really in the best interest of our customers to do this now? And so, and that can be argued either way, right? There will be people who say, well, yes, you must, right? Because there's no way we're going to get solar on the system if you don't. At the same point, maybe there's not much demand for that there, or maybe they're in a market where there's already enough capacity. So it just depends. And I think that's some of the tricky parts about this is saying, investments need to be made, which ones can be made, and which ones are we willing to invest in as a society, really.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it would be kind of a case by case basis in a way, but then also you could have the perspective. But if we're looking forward, we might as well start future proofing things, which
Yeah.
has been shown to be effective. Try to think ahead with the information that we have. I feel like we have a lot more data to work with now. Is that true? Do you feel like we have the information we need to accurately future proof so that we don't have to, go back again and take the lessons we've learned and try it again?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think, when you talk about data from the utility standpoint, it's a really new, it's a new thing. It's a new, not brand new, but it's, relatively new compared to other industries, particularly technology. There's, when we put these new meters on the system beginning about 10 years ago or so, and they're not everywhere yet, but for the most part, they provide a lot of information, back, and, energy use information, really down to the second intervals or 15-second intervals, into a minute intervals at times for everything, right? And so there's a lot of data coming in, but I think only recently have we begun as an industry to say, what can we do with this and how can we use this to better plan the system and operate the system? And so I think this is one of the areas I'm excited about is, how does this continue to evolve, and how can utilities take this information in a way that allows them to plan the system more on a more integrated basis. So you're not just looking at, one utility's distribution system, but you're also looking at the transmission system as a whole. You're also looking at generation, and, so are you planning new power plants using the information from your EV charger? That's the kind of distinction that we're trying to drive to. I don't think we're there yet, but I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Oh, certainly. Opportunity seems to be like lurking around every corner or just right in your face.
For sure.
It might not even be that hidden. Yeah. And it's like transitioning from a wire centric grid to one that is more surrounded by computers, sensors, remote controlling, remote monitoring. Are there any even emerging technologies or technologies that you see as the most impactful for utilities? I'm sure like they have to prioritize things. So I don't know if you're like, well, you should prioritize this over this, or it's case to case basis. But yeah, could you tell me more about the technologies that you see really making a difference?
I think, certainly. You're right. It's going to be different for different places. But generally speaking, one of the things I'm most excited about, and I'll backtrack a little bit to provide some context. The grid used to be planned and operated, as I mentioned before. We will build as many power plants and as much grid capacity as we need to serve the demand for electricity, right? And the demand for electricity was unknowable, right? We can forecast it and we can kind of know what it's going to be, and we, over time we get pretty good at that. And so we build out the power plants and the wires and everything to serve that. But the demand itself, was out of the control of the utilities, and still is to some degree. But I think that's what's maybe changing. And so one of the things that I think is going to be interesting to see how it develops over the next few years is, instead of just looking at power plants and generation capacity as our resources that we can manage, we're also going to be looking at load, or the demand for electricity, as a resource, not just as an end use, but as a resource to also help manage the system. And I'll give you an example of that. It might be a combination of things like smart thermostats, right? And there are already a lot of utility programs across the country where the utility can go in and knock your thermostat up or down a little bit depending on the season to help, again, manage that flow of energy. Same thing with managed charging. Managed charging EVs is a great case study of this, when maybe they're going to either derate or ask or encourage or incentivize EV drivers to charge at different times of the day. And so there's those technologies. There's things like smart water heaters, particularly things like heat pump water heaters. So maybe you don't need, when we're all at work during the day, I don't need my water heater to be kept hot all day necessarily. It's using energy. Maybe I can tailor that in a way to where it heats up right before I wake up in the morning, or heats up in the late afternoon, or whenever it needs to be. But the exciting point, all of these things have been around for a while, but what's exciting now is that we're getting to a point where many think that we can begin to pull all these things together and aggregate them in a way with technology, use them together as a resource. And so you can use your your smart thermostats, your water heaters, your air conditioning, and your EV charger, and the solar panels on your roof, and energy storage at your neighbor's house. All these things can be all pulled together and aggregated and then treated just like we would treat a power plant. And we call these virtual power plants, which are primarily using the demand for electricity as a resource to balance the grid. So I think that's getting, it's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I think that's one of those exciting things that in the future, instead of just being end users of electricity, we may be really part of playing a role in how we use energy all day and helping to kind of manage the grid and manage the system. And ultimately, I think those things help to manage costs, help to bring costs down, make the system more efficient. It'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, because we've seen a lot of promises and ideas come from automakers too to have the vehicle to grid or vehicle to everything, which is like, yeah, we've got a battery on wheels that is mostly parked, so it could be plugged in, so it could be used to buffer the grid. Where do you think we are with that?
Yeah,
It seems like a great idea.
I know, right? It does. I think there are some use cases where it makes sense, right? And everyone has seen the school bus V2G pilots, and that's one of those use cases that it's kind of a slam dunk, right? Because the vehicles are just not being used all the time, and particularly on a seasonal basis, right? They're parked during that summer when our peaks are really, really high. But I think from a consumer vehicle, I think fleets, there might be some opportunities there. There might be a business opportunity for large electrified fleets to do some B2G, but I think there are some complications we need to iron out. I think certainly around battery degradation or what the impacts on the vehicle are going to be. I think, depending on who you talk to, that's bigger or lesser of a concern. I think the biggest issue at the end of the day is going to be around how you compensate an EV driver for that energy they inject. Right. Yeah. And so it always comes back to money, right? That's the sad truth. It always comes back to that. But how do you pay the EV for the energy they're putting back into the system? That's why I think that what we're probably going to have first is this kind of vehicle to building, right? You're going to have maybe plugging to your home to provide a resiliency or to provide some benefit, almost acting like a generator if the power went down, or to reduce demand at your house when there's a time of stress. You don't have to be compensated for it. It doesn't have to go all the way back into the energy system, but you can kind of use it locally. So I think that's going to take off first, and we'll see how, true vehicle to grid operates later on. But my suspicion is that may be less exciting than being able to plug into your home or somewhere and provide kind of services on a local basis.
It does sound very complicated, and we're still standardizing like the communication for public charging and then also at-home charging and all of that, so that it's complicated. That it hasn't come quickly. I don't, there's a lot to work out. I'm not exactly, the technical side of things over there, but it does seem like there's potential, but we still are definitely figuring it out. Yeah. And with it makes me think of software as well, and utilities with software. I mean, I don't know about utilities in general, but I'm not sure what software systems that they are using. And I know that we talked about like how essentially software is mixed in when we're modernizing the grid. I'm sure like with the metering and everything, but it's also tangible, like infrastructure and the distributed energy resource systems like you talked about. But how is software, is it just kind of lumped in with the modernization? But it seems to me distinct from the hardware and the infrastructure and all of the tangible pieces that we're also modernizing. How's that?
Yeah,
how's that go?
It really is across the board. And I think, like a lot of businesses, particularly larger businesses, there was a lot of investment in kind of, these big platform systems, right? 20 or even 30 years ago, billing systems and all this kinds of stuff as we kind of went through this first wave of digitalization. And there's a lot of investment now into updating those systems and moving them off premise, right? To go to kind of cloud solutions or other kind of larger enterprise solutions that are more manageable, require fewer customizations and that kind of stuff. But it's everything. It's it's billing systems, right? It's the systems that they use to not physically, but to manipulate and manage the grid, operate the grid. The planning systems, the software they use to plan electricity flows. A lot of development is happening there. Those used to be very standalone. You'd have one system that did planning for this purpose and one system that did it for this purpose. And now we're starting to see that some of those come together. Another interesting area we're seeing is for utilities that have both natural gas and electricity customers, some new software solutions that allow planning for both, right? And so as you electrify heating, right, so as you move customers from gas furnaces to heat pumps, what is the impact that has on the electric system? So you need to be able to plan across commodities now in a way you didn't have to. At the same time, there's a real shift to third parties, people that are outside of the utility business that are providing services to the grid. And so it might be an EV charging company that can control and manipulate all their chargers and can sell energy back to the grid or demand. And so there is software that exists outside of the utility periphery that now has to come in and maybe integrate and talk to those systems. So a lot of evolution happening here. It's interesting because I think there's not really a standard that's taking hold. It's really kind of a lot of different solutions that are coming to the table at the moment.
Interesting. It seems so complicated. but maybe it's not when you actually know it. I mean, if you're in the utility industry, if you're consulting, you're like, I can see this picture coming together. Is that generally the approach, or is it like, oh, this is a bit of a headache, we've got to revamp everything?
Yes, both. It is complex. I think it really is. And I think that's one of the things that utilities are struggling with. They went from a very simple, and it was never simple, but a more simple world. And that world is becoming, and it is for all of us, right? We can make the argument this, everything's getting more complicated, but it's becoming a lot more complex. The things that they're required to do have become more complex. The reasons they plan out the system have evolved and are changing. The demands on the system are changing. The tools they use are changing. So I think you're right. The complexity can't be understated here. I think there's a lot of frustration. Utilities just don't move quick enough. They don't move fast enough. They don't do this. Why are we still waiting to interconnect this charger? Or, why aren't there charging stations everywhere, right? And I think if you were kind of behind the ropes, you would see it in a different way. There's just a lot of different priorities that are all kind of converging at the same time. And, we've certainly seen it with Barrel, right? Reliability continues to be a real priority. If the lights don't come on, a lot of this other stuff doesn't matter, as much. But managing through all of those things, I think, is just driven a lot of, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, but it's not trivial.
I'm sure it's not. But there are these points that come up, like you were saying, you're basically quoting things that I've heard, like, why does it move this slow? Why can't we just get it connected? Why is it taking so long for this transformer to be delivered to a site that was built? And I don't have the answers. Do you have an answer to that question, about the supply chain? That might be out of your reach. So tell me if it is.
I think this is really interesting because I just had a conversation with a client about this last week. And so and this particular client, the amount of infrastructure that they need to build over the next couple of years is doubled to what they did over the last 3 years, for instance. And so they immediately have, do they have enough people to do it, time and all this other stuff, right? And so they have this, they know they need to start procuring transformers. Transformers is, just one piece of what goes into this, but it's a great example. They have to start buying this stuff now because the lead times on transformers in particular are quite long, 6 months to 2 years, depending on the case. And what this client told us last week in talking with them is their biggest competitor for transformers is Google and Amazon, not other power companies, not other utilities, not charging station developers. It's Google and Amazon who are going out and procuring a lot of transformers to build data centers, right? And so there's a lot of demand for these components of the electric system that never used to be, competitive in the way they are now. Or there never, didn't used to be as many players or as much demand for this equipment as there is now. And of course, Google and Amazon can pay a little bit more for a transformer than the typical utility can. So it's a challenge. So they've still got to build out the system just to meet our basic needs, and at the same time, they're competing with these other companies for these resources, and so it's a new world.
Mm. Yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting. Of course, there are different needs for the transformers. And then, I mean, I got to think, okay, well, then more companies should make transformers, but that would be building up more of the industry. I'm not sure what like supply chain
Yeah.
issues they're running into. So maybe it's a combination of different use cases, people being able to pay more, like you're saying, for these data centers, Google and Amazon, and then also the whatever supply chain issues that might exist along the way, or a shortage of folks that are producing these transformers.
Yeah, I think there's been some recent investment, to bring more transformer manufacturing and other electrical system components, more of that stuff back to U.S. Just more of it generally. I think this is a worldwide or global demand for this kind of equipment. So I would expect to see there being a lot of investments made in manufacturing capacity here.
And I think I understand this, but do you mind briefly explaining why is a transformer so essential? Like does this finish an EV site?
I think we talk about transformers a lot because, I don't know, maybe it's fun to say, I don't know, but there's there's lots of components, right? Lots of stuff goes into substations and into different components. But effectively, a transformer will take something that's higher voltage and make it lower voltage. It will transform the current to meet the end use. And so all of us plug in our plugs into the wall, and that uses a very low voltage, for our microwave ovens or whatever it is. But the voltage coming into our houses are higher than that, and the voltages running through power lines is much higher, and in transmission lines is very, very high. The reason we want high voltage to be going through power lines is because the higher voltage it is, the fewer, the less of the power is lost through line losses. So, electricity flowing through lines makes them heat up, and that heat is a form of lost energy, right? Some of that energy is used to heat the line, so it creates line losses, and it's a few percent of the energy that starts at the front of the system. A few percent of that is lost by the time it gets to the end, and so the higher the voltage, the fewer the losses, and so you want to that's why transmission lines are very, very high. But when it gets to your house, you don't want that coming to your house, so you want to step it down, and that's why those transformers are important. So what it does is it takes that higher voltage energy and then it transforms it into something that, whether it's a substation or an EV charger or a hairdryer, whatever it is, can be used appropriately.
Okay, yeah, that totally lines up on why everyone might need that for their projects when it comes to pulling energy.
But there's lots of components out there in the system, and capacitors and all kinds of switchgear and all kinds of things that get into all the nerdy stuff that goes into engineering.
We love the nerdy stuff, and as we look towards the future. You already are envisioning a future where EV infrastructure is where we need it to be, which is great. I'm going to spend some more time thinking about exactly what that would look like. But a lot of our audiences that we're in the industry, or we're EV enthusiasts, or both, whatever it is. But I'm thinking, okay, so from my standpoint, I don't work in utilities, but like, how can I best prepare or be knowledgeable about the integration of EVs and modernized grids into the world? Like, what can I expect? Is there anything that I can do as a person to either educate myself or like serve as a proponent of this modernization?
That's a really good question. And it's hard for me to kind of think in those terms sometimes, but I think one of the interesting things I've seen about that goes along with the kind of the electrification and transportation generally is that I think we're all becoming a bit smarter about the system. I think can all of us really kind of grew up in this environment where you just kind of turn the lights on, you just expect them to come on. They just do, right? And we're really lucky, particularly in North America and in the U.S., we're very lucky to have generally very high reliability, right? I mean, all of us expect the lights to come on when we hit the switch. It's never really in doubt. On the flip side of that, it's made us pretty complacent about how it works and where it comes from and all of those things we've been talking about, right? And so I think, just becoming knowledgeable about that kind of stuff generally, I think is just basically useful. But I think as people have transitioned to EVs, because you kind of need to, right? You kind of need to develop some of that inherent knowledge just because you got to plan a little bit better, right? You got to understand how much energy you're using or when you need to have your car charged by or different things, or how far you can go before you need to charge and how long you want to sit there, So there's a lot more kind of thinking about it, which I think is great. I think that's helpful. But I think maybe there are a couple concepts that are just kind of fundamental to that maybe your audience can kind of just maybe think about going forward. And one is just that time variability of the price and the capacity of energy, right? It's not constant. It was only just a few years ago, and for 99% of the history of the electric system, when the generation of power had to be matched almost perfectly with the consumption of electricity, right? So the power plants, somewhere are ramping up and down to match, depending on how many people are turning on their blenders or, their air conditionings and things in real time. It's crazy, right? And no other commodity in the world would we do something like that. And you would never design it that way if you didn't have to. With energy storage, we're getting to a point where there's, we have now some tools. So where that's not necessarily always the case, but it's still more or less the fact that you have to match that supply and demand almost perfectly. There's no warehouse you can store that excess energy, not very many. So that's one thing. And I think, understanding the demands of using electricity on the grid, on the system. The more of it we use, it's not just that more can be delivered. The grid is something that's evolving, and it's kind of really evolving in real time. We hear the analogy about kind of building the plane while it's flying, right? And this is kind of the situation we're in with the grid right now. We've kind of built it, and now we're kind of remodeling it as we're flying it. So, a lot of transformation is happening. And then maybe just the last thing is, and this is going to be a very utility centric, or at least focus from where I sit. In our work with utilities and the folks that work utilities, they are so dedicated to keeping the lights on and keeping rates low and keeping power affordable and keeping it reliable. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. We are frustrated because they don't move very quickly, and we're frustrated because our bills keep on going up. And I get it; it is frustrating. But the people who work behind the scenes are some of the most incredibly dedicated people that I've worked for. It's pretty interesting how devoted most of them are to just serving, just every day, making sure that when we wake up in the morning, our toasters can work and microwaves can work and everything else. And they're pretty dedicated to it. And it's impressive.
That's nice to hear. I think those are great lessons to take away. And I think it's very interesting work that you're doing. And I have truly learned so much in this conversation. So I so appreciate it, because I also think you're articulate, where you can take this knowledge that you have and break it down. And I mean, I understood every word that you said. So I really appreciate that. I feel like this was a great lesson in utilities, which is what I've been looking for. So thank you so much.
You bet. I could talk about it all day, and I love it. It's a fascinating topic. So thanks for having us.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm sure our audience will have questions too. And I feel like generally this gave a great overview. And there's also so many things that you could dive into for hours and talk about, and the intricacies of it. And it's hard to ignore how big of a role utilities and energy plays in our world when you're driving an EV, because then you start to just really, and it's the way that you're getting around, which we're not really used to that from the fuel, from the ICE cars, etc.
Exactly.
So I think it's a cool new perspective on it, that, like you were saying, we can also start to better acknowledge like how the energy is being created, used, flowing through our lives, and all the moving parts.
Absolutely right.
Great. And everyone, we'll see you next time on the next episode. Drive safe, stay charged. Bye-bye.